Thank you so much. My day job is I teach philosophy. You notice the modesty of that description, because if you say, I am a philosopher, it puts you in the first team with Aristotle and Descartes and so on, and that's a bit of a tall order. So I say I teach philosophy when I'm asked what I do. Cab drivers, when I give them that answer, almost immediately ask me what the meaning of life is. And I always tell them that I know the answer. Not that I came up with it, but that the philosophical tradition provides us with that answer. And in the course of what I will be saying to you this afternoon, that answer will emerge, because it is very intimately connected with the question of our autonomy, our self-direction in life, and the way that the purpose of our lives gives them significance. But you will know that philosophy is the adventure of careful, rational, systematic thought, trying to make sense of things, to dig down into the assumptions that shape our lives, trying to discern those values that bear scrutiny and which, if we accept them, can shape and colour our lives in very productive ways. Most particularly, of course, given that we are social animals, in our relationships with one another, because good lives have at their heart good relationships. So this adventure of rational thought very often seems to throw up what look like paradoxes, seeming paradoxes, because when one examines the paradoxes, one finds that they aren't, but that they encapsulate deep truths. For example, I always begin by telling my students the anecdote about the two old ladies heard on the Glasgow bus, one saying to the other, "My dear, you must be philosophical about this. Don't give it another thought." Which actually captures something from one of the richest and most wonderful traditions in ethics, which is the Stoic tradition. You may remember that Stoicism was, for half a millennium, the outlook of educated people in the Hellenic and Roman worlds. And it was a view, even if people didn't subscribe to other aspects of the Stoic philosophy, like its metaphysics and its logic and so on, but nevertheless really captures something that we think of, those of us who spent part of our childhoods anyway reading about ancient Rome and all its great heroes, something about that kind of spirit. Because the Stoics taught this, that with respect to those things that one can't do anything about, tsunamis and earthquakes and overwhelming disease or aging, we must try to face them with courage and bear them with fortitude. But with respect to those things that we have some degree of control over, our own appetites, our own fears, our own desires, we should try to achieve some degree of self-mastery. And if we can live with courage to the outward and self-mastery towards the inner, then, they said, we will live with nobility. And that was the Stoic view. And that is what one old lady meant when she said to the other old lady on the Glasgow bus, "Don't give it another thought." What she meant was, be stoical, have fortitude, be brave, have courage. And of course, that is a great gift, to be able to teach oneself how to have courage. None of the great thinkers in the philosophical traditions of any of the world's civilizations have ever said that it's easy to be courageous. People who never feel fear are never courageous, because courage is something that you can only have if you're afraid, if you wake up terrified every morning, facing the difficulties and challenges of life, but you live anyway. That's what courage is. And so the Stoic teaching on that is a very pointful one. But to get to my theme, which is about how thinking about this paradox, the paradox that to face and to understand death and its meaning to our lives is what makes our lives better. And it's not just the point, a familiar one, and it's a good point, that our knowledge that death is inevitable. I haven't quite yet cracked that one, so we're all going to die at some point. We're all suffering the terminal illness known as life. So we all know that we're going to die, although our more advanced civilizations do everything they possibly can to try to postpone and ignore the fact of death. And we do it in lots and lots of different ways, by trying to stay young, or to stay looking young, or to pretend that we're not getting old, or to pretend that we're never going to be ill, and so on. But the inevitability of death, when confronted, really does do something of great importance to the quality of life, because it reminds us of that marvellous story told by Herodotus in the histories. You may remember the story about Solon, the sage of Athens, who went on a visit to the court of King Croesus of Lydia. King Croesus, by the way, was by far the richest person of ancient times, and he loved to have his guests taken down to the treasury, where his enormous panoply of wealth was on display. And when they came up to have dinner with him, he would say, "Who, in your opinion, is the happiest man in the world?" And they would be expected to say, "Well, you're a king and you're so rich." But Solon said, "I know somebody back in the suburbs there in Athens." And Croesus was very annoyed. "What? You choose a commoner over me?" he said. And Solon said, "Yes, because I don't know whether you're happy or not." Now, of course, I have to remind you that we in our modern world use the word happy to denote an emotional state, a sort of smiley state, cheerful, glad of heart. I don't think that's what happiness is. That's a misuse of the term. Think of what was intended by the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when the Americans used that in their Declaration of Independence. What they meant by happiness there was what had always been meant by it from ancient times to the near modern times, and that is a good state of life. To be a happy person is to be a person sheltered from the storm, with enough food to eat, whose children are safe, etc., etc., a good condition of life. So you might have toothache, you might have quarrel with your spouse, you might have to fill in your tax return, you might not be feeling what moderns call happy, but still you're happy because you're in a happy state of life. Now that's what Solon meant when he was talking to Croesus. And his reason, he said to Croesus, his reason for saying it is an urgent matter that you think about what would make you happy is the brevity of life. The brevity of life. My voice dropped for dramatic reasons at that point. If you consider, said Solon, that the average human lifespan is less than 1,000 months long. Do the maths. If you live until you're 80, what's 12 times 80? 960 months. 300 of them, unless you party a lot, you're asleep. Another 300 months, you're waiting for a bus, or you're in Tesco, if you're lucky, in Waitrose. So you have 300 months to live with all the vividness and passion that a human life should be full of. And when you think of it in those terms, then of course it seems rather alarming. But I can cap this anecdote by telling you, in the earlier part of my career, I used to teach at the University of Oxford, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And I was on my way back to London one night because I was commuting. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder how much time I have left. I did a bit of mental arithmetic. And I thought, oh my God, I'm nearly dead. And I haven't read any Smollett. When I got home, I said to my partner, I said, I'm nearly dead. I haven't read any Smollett. She said, well, it's all right. We've got some on the bookcase here. In the bath that night, I began to read Smollett. After about 4 pages, I threw it out of the bath, thinking to myself, oh, hooray, at least I don't have to read that. But when I got back to Oxford the next day, I told one of my literature colleagues, and he said, what? Smollett is marvellous. You must read Smollett. And I thought, I must read Smollett and I'm nearly dead. Oh, God, the pressure. You can just imagine when you become conscious of the fact that time's swift foot. And then I had an epiphany. I remembered I'm a professor of philosophy, and I know that there is no such thing as time. That was a great relief, faced with this conundrum. By the way, it's very, very easy to prove that there is no such thing as time in the normal sense, as follows. Suppose you go to Paris for the weekend with someone you really like. And while you're there forever. But when you're home again on the Monday morning, it's gone like a flash. This shows you that time is very elastic around experience. The thing that really counts is experience, not time. You can prove the point the other way. Imagine a person who does exactly the same thing at exactly the same time every single day of his life. Eats the same breakfast, reads the same words, does exactly the same thing every day. How many days does that person live? 1. So now you can see there's no such thing as time in the conventional sense. There is experience. So much can be said about what gives us a rich and fulfilling experience, the kind that makes us live 3,000 months or 300 lifetimes, the kind that really matters, makes life full and flourishing. But one of the things that does is how we address the question of our mortality. And here I think one of the great lessons that we can learn from the philosophers is this. Seneca, Cicero, others in the late Hellenic and Roman periods very often meditated on the question and wrote about the question of mortality and what it meant. And they came up with an insight. And the insight in question is this, that to learn how to philosophize is to learn how to die. To learn how to philosophize is to learn how to die. That is the seeming paradox that I wanted to bring up to you. Because it is, in fact, a wonderful insight. What it shows you is this, that if your attitude to death is a good, healthy attitude, it liberates you to live your life fearlessly and richly. If you are not afraid of death, if you are not trying to run away from it, if you don't devote energy to anxieties about being mortal, then you live every moment, every day with the kind of fullness that life should be lived with. Their point was this, that if you squarely faced the fact of mortality, it would be very liberating. But if you also recognize something else which is important about death, namely that it is your last, greatest, securest, and most friendly act of freedom, that if you wished to end your life, that if there was something intolerable about existence, if there was some tremendous danger that you faced, if there was illness, if old age became insupportable, then you had a route into freedom from those conditions. That death is a liberation for people who find living painful or intolerable or insufferable. It is something which you own. You own the possibility of your own death, of your own exit from things that you find that you no longer want to bear. And once you know that, they said, this is that both Seneca and Cicero wrote on this matter, they said once you realize that you have the key to an ultimate freedom, you fear nothing any longer. And then you can live with the kind of freshness and vividness that life should be lived with. And so to look squarely at death and ask yourself, what is there to fear from it? This is something I think people in this room probably, very probably, that don't have any concerns about. We may very well think that when we die, dying, which is a living act, of course, could be unpleasant, it could be difficult, it could be easy, and we would all like it to be easy. That's why we use the term euthanasia. That literally just means a good death, a good dying. But death itself, the state of being death, is no different from the state of being unborn. I don't know whether you kicked up a fuss before your parents conceived you, but you're scarcely likely to do so after you've died. There's no difference. Once you realize that, then you see, and also once you've accepted, as any grown-up consciousness should, its inevitability, then you see it as the great release, the great escape, the great route out of anything that ultimately you find intolerable. And that fact, once you've realized it, once you've grasped it, and once you've put it in your back pocket, so to speak, you can forget about it, and then you can live life fully and richly. You know, the hypochondriac. Well, I will confess to you that when I was a very young man, I had a spell as a hypochondriac. A lot of young people going in that difficult passage from adolescence into young adulthood can feel the stresses and strains. Some people rather dear to me. My mother, my sister died at about the time I was 19 or 20. The frailty of life, the very thinness of the thread, as it seemed to me at the time, that held people from slipping over into a completely different kind of existence, that is my own, an existence without people that I cared about and so on. I think it unnerved me for a while, and I used to take my pulse when nobody was looking, and every now and then it would skip a beat, and I'd think, oh my God, I'm going, you know. And I do remember one hilarious night when I woke up with a very sharp pain in the middle of my chest, and I thought, this is it. And I rather cautiously elbowed a very nice person who was next to me, and she said, what is it? And I said, I think I'm dying. And she, you know, that way that you are when you really don't want to wake up, said, oh, really? Like that, you know. I said, yes. You know, I'll sue if I die, you know, why don't you get to wake up? She said, why don't you sit up? And I said, no, because I thought if I did, it would precipitate something awful. She said, go on, sit up. So I did. That was a nice burp, and I felt perfectly all right again after. I began to realize that actually what the problem was not that I didn't want to die or that I was scared of dying, but that as a young, ambitious man, I hadn't yet done some of the things that I wanted to do. That was the thing, that I was afraid of not being able to complete things that I wanted to do. And that generalizes. You know, you have quarrels with your family, you fall out with a friend, there are things left undone that you ought to have done. We're all familiar with that phrase. We should, I think, consider what it is that makes us cling on to life, other than the natural, normal human anxiety about you know, those residual fears we have that we might meet with something after death, the undiscovered country. So this sense of being afraid of dying because one is not living properly and fully is exactly what the philosophers meant when they said to think about what death means for life, and to be able to grasp it, see it clearly, put it in your back pocket, then you are liberated to live. If you felt, supposing you felt that you were under a law which meant that you could not escape your sufferings, supposing there was a law which said no matter what your state of health, the extent to which some devastating illness had reached, you would never be allowed to leave it. You're not allowed to die. Every effort has got to be made to keep you alive, no matter how much you're suffering. That would be a terrifying prospect, wouldn't it? It would be a terrifying prospect to be a prisoner of life, even in its worst dimensions. Think of it this way. And this, in fact, arises from an argument that we put in the case of Diane Pretty many years ago, when her request that her husband be allowed to help her to die and not be prosecuted afterwards. You remember this case. It's going on for more than 15 years ago now. And I remember writing an amicus curiae brief for the House of Lords, or which it was then, on this case when it reached the House of Lords, and pointing out that we had been arguing in favour of her right under the Human Rights Convention to privacy, to autonomy, to making a choice, and because she was physically incapacitated, she needed help, and therefore she was being denied her right. 1962 Suicide Act had taken away or decriminalised any life, but she wasn't able to do it herself. But I wanted to add to this argument another consideration, which is that all human rights regimes have in them a provision about a right to life. And I wanted to argue that a right to life is not a right to mere existence. That if I lock you in a tiny little cage and I feed you on bread and water and I keep you in the dark, you're alive, but I can't claim to be respecting your right to life. Because if you think what a right to a life is, to be a living, breathing, moving, choosing, relating human being, that's what a life is, a life of a certain minimum quality. And that once that quality is gone, once the meaning to oneself of one's existence is gone, what one then has is a right to die. And it seems to me as clear and as simple but as deep a point as that a right to life is a right to a minimum quality of life, and that the absence of that quality triggers the right to die. Now, we're all familiar with various arguments. The point I'm putting is an extremely general one here about the autonomy of the individual, as was regarded by people like Seneca and Cicero. They took it that a person had a right to end their lives at any point that they chose. And indeed, that is the situation that prevails for most of us now. None of us need to be helped by a physician to die. I'm a member of Dignitas, so when the time comes, I'm on a plane, EasyJet, off to Switzerland. But you don't need it. You could find a high building if you weren't going to make too much of a mess and upset other people and so on. That's a consideration which one always has to have in mind. So it's no longer a criminal act. It's something that you have a right to do, and you could do it autonomously. But if you were not in a position to do it, if you were paralyzed or extremely ill or had no access to means of dying well, then having a right to die is negated by not having a right to be helped to die if you need the help. That's a further consideration. In other words, the jurisprudence, the philosophy of this becomes richer and more complicated when you understand what some of the entailments are of thinking about according people this right. If people have a right to die, then assuredly they have a right to be helped to die if they can't do it for themselves. Now, we think in our modern world about the kinds of difficulties that come up when we discuss the right to die. For example, our anxieties about vulnerable people, elderly people, disabled people, being persuaded that they're a burden and being asked to consider dying, committing suicide, or being helped to die, precisely because they're a burden. It may not be a burden to themselves, but to other people. And we want to protect people from that. It seems to me, without really having to go into the arguments, that it must be possible to ensure that that doesn't happen. It must be possible. It's not outside the wit of humankind to devise checks that would enable us to protect people who are vulnerable and to find out whether they really do have an autonomous wish to die. In the case of the background argument, the argument that says somehow or other the thought of people electing to die, let alone the thought of allowing them to get help to die, is rooted in a sort of position of anathema. This great anxiety that we have to live and to postpone death and to avoid thinking about it has its roots in a complex and very often undiscussed aspect of our thinking about the nature of the good life. And part of that, and a very important part of it, of course, is the idea that we are not genuinely autonomous, that we don't own our own lives, that we don't have a right to choose when they will end. And this comes, of course, from a long tradition of religious attitudes about the matter. Life is given by God, and God decides when our lives end, and that it is a kind of blasphemy, it's a kind of lèse majesté against the will of God to defy that gift, to reject it, to commit suicide. It's regarded as the most terrible kind of sin to take away a life that doesn't belong to you. Well, in a more secular age, and in an age where people may not any longer share those sorts of beliefs, and certainly perhaps even for people who have a religious faith, still it may not seem to them impossible to imagine a God, if there is one, who is kind enough to understand the nature of suffering, who is generous enough to accord some degree of autonomy beyond the capacity to commit sins, which after all is what the deity is so organized things that we can make a mess of our lives and get ourselves punished and so on. So we have that degree of autonomy. You might expect we might have one or two others as well. And one of them might be to choose when we've had enough. So the idea there is that the ultimate decision, the ultimate owner, the locus of possession of a life is the person living it. Who otherwise can really know how it is to be that person, what it is to be that individual, to feel that way about living? We sometimes think, oh, well, people get depressed and terribly anxious. They may be going through an awful phase. Something may happen. They may come out of it. They may meet someone, fall in love. The depression may go away. We might find medications that would really help. So if only we could keep them alive through that, then everything will be all right again later. And that may very well be true. But you have to ask yourself the question whether a person sunk in the agonies of depression and anxiety, and you say to somebody, look, just stick with it for the next few weeks or months or years, and then maybe things will be okay in the future. Is that a demand that is weighty enough against the momentary, moment after moment experience of agony that person is experiencing, that somehow or other gives us a right to deny them that right to choose to escape that condition? So when I talk here about the life that belongs to you, I'm talking about this very fundamental idea of autonomy, because in other respects, our autonomy is central to who we are and to the quality of our lives, both positively and negatively. The negative sense is that our autonomy makes us responsible for what we do, including the harms that we do. It places on us burdens of responsibility, of care for others, for respecting and considering and being alert to the fact that we are members of communities. That each one of us in this room, each person in this world, with a very rare exception, how few people there are in the world who like to be alone or cold or lonely or loveless. But we all know that we need to receive love and to give it, to have friends, to be parts of communities. We know these facts about ourselves. And in navigating those needs and those obligations that we have a sense of our responsibilities. They're serious responsibilities, not to harm others, to help others, to be alert and aware about others. And this is a function of our autonomy. You can't say, oh, well, I'm unkind to everybody, but it's not my fault, it's something else's fault. My genes or society or Brexit or something like that. You can't keep on blaming other things. You do have to take responsibility and ownership in those respects. We know that. But the obverse of that coin is that we also therefore own the length and the nature and the quality of our lives. And the decision about whether they matter enough to us to continue is our own. Let's go back to our ancient philosophers and notice this. They, like us, knew that the great majority of us want to live. We want to live, we want to love, we want to go out to dinner, we want to read the winning book of the Booker Prize. We want to, there are things that we relish about our lives. There are also plenty of things that we're fed up with, especially at the moment, that's true. But on the whole, we relish our lives, and we're not all of us going to rush off like a bunch of lemmings and hurl ourselves under the nearest bus passing down the Euston Road. But we would like to be able, if we choose and if we need, to call it a day when we, each of us individually, wants to do so. That is the thing that gives us that greater sense of freedom, a greater sense of ownership in our lives. And that is exactly what the philosophers of antiquity taught. And not just the philosophers of antiquity, but also philosophers of the modern period. Perhaps one of the greatest of them is Spinoza, who said, the meditation of the wise person is a meditation not on death, but on life. He was in the context of talking about death and the presence of death in life and the meaning of death in life. And he was making, but in different words, exactly the same point. That if one understands what death is, and if one knows that it can be a great friend, of course it can be an enemy. Of course, if death comes too soon or in terrible circumstances or the experience of reaching the point of death, that is, the experience of dying is an unpleasant one, of course it's horrible. But then there are lots of other things that are horrible in life too. Divorce, taxes, bad weather. There are plenty of things that you can put it in with, maybe sometimes a bit worse. But the use that it has, this twofold use of giving our life a shape, but also being what ultimately gives us our final freedom if we choose it. Those two things make us realize that a grasp of them liberates us to live fully and richly. That, I think, is the really great benefit that comes from all of us knowing that if we ever got into a situation which we found intolerable, we could be helped to leave. Those of us who are able-bodied enough could do it anyway, provided we did it thoughtfully. If we were in a position that we couldn't help ourselves, that we would be able to. Modern medical science makes it possible for deaths, the process of dying, to be an easy and a peaceful one, which is good for the person dying, good for the people who love the person who's dying, and good to know that you have access to it, because it completes this sense of autonomy, which is so central to our lives. So I think we as a society, and this is my final point, we as a society have had the drag anchor on us of feeling that it is not up to us as individuals to ponder on death. That's an unhealthy thing, or that we should kill ourselves. That's a really bad thing. It is just assumed that if you want to die, you must be mad. Every single suicide was judged by a coroner to have been of unsound mind when it happened. Just a sort of a knee-jerk. Whereas many of those people who chose to leave life because it was no longer of the right quality for them, or because of the agony, and my God, some of the physical and psychological agonies that are open to us imaginative, sensitive creatures, I think everybody in this room knows them, knows about grief and loss and pain and illness and fear. And to think that death can be an escape from those things, as Hamlet says, is a consummation devoutly to be wished. But we're not rushing towards it. We're not wanting it. We're wanting the possibility of it in case we need it. That is the great thing that really in itself represents freedom. So the drag anchor on us has been a long tradition of religious presumptions against our entitlement to take our own lives or to end our own lives when we feel that we no longer want to live them. That has been a barrier to us. That has made a great difference between us and the classical period, where the fact that it was regarded as an honourable and a decent and a noble thing to do in its right context meant that life had this added dimension of value, the value that you really owned it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. We've got some time for questions, and I believe we have a roving mic who happens to be next to the first hand that went up. So let's have the first question.
Questions, comments, or complaints, by the way. I'll write down.
Thank you, Professor Grayling. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I think, however, you were preaching to conversion. We all here embrace being in control of our own death. I think that's why we're here. The point is, we can't get it. And with all of your wonderful brain power and all of ours, this country still won't budge towards this freedom. That's the real question to me.
Yes, you're quite right. Well, yes, I know I'm preaching to the converted. It's always jolly nice to do that. It makes life a lot easier. However, it does help. People talk about being in a bubble and just talking within the bubble. It does keep everybody energized in that bubble, and it also equips people with arguments that they can use outside the bubble. So it's no bad thing preaching to the converted sometimes. It happens in church every Sunday. But you're quite right that the really great question is how are we to get society to change its view about this? Now, I'm deeply, deeply honoured to be a patron of this organisation, because I think this organisation has an opportunity to start afresh with our thinking and arguing about this matter. Because I've been a patron of Dignity in Dying, as was the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, for many, many years, more than 20 years now. And we have tried again and again and again and again and again to get bills through Parliament for physician-assisted suicide for people in terminal illness. Early on, actually, including not just terminal illness, but also intolerable states. And we temporized and we weakened our position and changed our ask, and eventually it got down to saying, well, in the last 6 months of some completely and utterly unrecoverable physical illness, and could we please make it legal for a doctor to help that person to die, rather than leaving it to the situation which currently obtains, where lots of very compassionate doctors do help their patients to die, obviously, but always with the risk of having committed a criminal offence if everybody makes a fuss about it. And we've been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. It is always a mistake to aim for 50, hoping you're going to hit 25 and hitting 0. You should go for 100.
Yeah.
And you should make the case as robustly and consistently as possible. And you have to somehow or other keep faith. None of us may be here by the time we get society to change its mind. But there comes a point in a great conversation that society has with itself, where suddenly a tipping point is reached. We know that we have a majority of people on our side. If you stop people in the street and you ask them questions, would you like to be able to choose to die, to be helped to die if you were, things were really, really bad? The great majority of people, as we know, would say yes. The thought of being kept alive or of not having that escape is horrifying when people really address it. So keep the argument going, keep it going, keep it going. It may seem as if you're banging your head against a brick wall, but suddenly there's a chink of light, then a tipping point is reached, then there's a cascade effect, and things can change very rapidly. So one should fight for the big prize, and one should keep on fighting, one should have courage and persistence, and it will come.
And it's hardly surprising as a philosopher, you put a lot of emphasis on rationality and logic and making a choice. But as I get older, I increasingly become aware that myself, my friends and society are really influenced much more by unconscious attitudes and behaviors. I wonder how we should be taking more account of that. How could we do that?
You're absolutely right, of course, that the vast majority of people, if not indeed all, are really motivated and impelled by non-rational aspects of themselves, by their feelings, their attitudes, their emotions. Now, the process of education, you look at somebody who spent his life in education, and you would think I would be mad to do so if I thought that rationality had no role to play at all. And you're quite right that it doesn't play the kind of role where people sit down and do a sort of logical deduction and say, oh, I think I better kill myself now, not wanting to. But here's the thing. Think of very, very small kids. They are anarchists. And the process of bringing up a child is the process of trying to educate its emotions, trying to make its rationality connect up with its emotions enough for it to restrain itself or suppress some of its more anarchic, angry, greedy kind of emotions, and to direct and channel the more positive emotions in ways that would be fruitful. So the education of the emotions, the education of our sensibilities, getting our feelings to be moving in the right direction, changing our attitudes, that's an important part of the great debate. You're dead right that you couldn't give a syllogistic reason to people who are not convinced already, and hope that that might change their minds. That doesn't happen very often. But what you can do is you can think carefully about the sorts of things that do reach people's emotions and attitudes and might help them to change their orientation towards the problem. Stories do this, narratives do this. We find ourselves when we know about individual cases, when we actually confront the sufferings of somebody we love, then that really does change the way that we feel. So you're dead right that the campaign has to address how we deal with people's feelings and attitudes about these matters. Naturally, we are all quite rational people, and we've got to think of rational ways of reaching the non-rational. By the way, the non-rational incorporates as a subspecies of itself the irrational, and as you know, there's no dealing with the irrational. But you can deal with the non-rational, which after all, our feelings, our emotions, our affections, are probably the most important part of us. And that is the thing that we must reach by these various means. By poetry, by stories, by narratives, by anecdotes, by the human contact and witness that we can bear to a way of thinking about things.
The context where the individual is, or in this exactly as you described, we should be able to make decisions about death. But in terms of society, things have just changed. We know now that society is unlikely to continue for more than another 50, 60 years. What do we tell our grandchildren about having children, about building anything, when they themselves are unlikely to be witnessing the end of the world?
Oh well. For reasons that you can imagine, I don't like the phrase, well, it's only academic. But if the end of the world is coming, then I think we could all change our endeavours here this afternoon to something else. Let's play bridge or something. We don't need to campaign for the fact that the world's going to end. I don't know where you get that from. I think actually that there are other risks and dangers. You know, the presence of artificial intelligence and robotics and machine learning systems and so on, these things are already among us. They're already happening. They're already beginning to have quite a major effect on our world and how we live, and even on jobs and employment. And it's not too fanciful to think in 20, 30, 40 years' time that many of the things that human beings do now will be better done by such systems. Teaching mathematics to primary school children, for example, that already happens. Brain surgery is probably better done by a robot than a human being. There are all sorts of things, flying aeroplanes, taxis, motorcars. There'd be a huge transformation in the world. And the big question is, will there ever be what they call AGI, which is artificial general intelligence? That is to say, an intelligence which is somewhat like our own, except trillions of times more powerful than our own. And this is predicted because if we were to make a system as a bit more intelligent than ourselves, it would very quickly build a system even more intelligent than itself, and so on, exponentially. So within a matter of hours, there would be this absolutely super-duper AI system, which would think to itself, what is the most annoying, irritating, and destructive thing on the planet? Answer, human beings, and it wouldn't take it very long to hack all the systems and get rid of us all, and then we wouldn't have to bother about this. But on the assumption that humanity will continue for a while, and wanting human beings to live in circumstances of genuine autonomy, we have all the technology, the medical technology, and so on, that would now make it unnecessary for as many people to die in pain or suffering or mental agony as happened in the past. That is the thing that we should be pushing for now, a much more humane society. In fact, we're asking for something as, in its way, as little and as inoffensive as this, that we should be allowed exactly the same courtesy that we give our pets. Oh, no hand shooting. Yes.
I'm not sure that irrationality is in general population is the obstacle, because, as you said, about 80% of people are very much in favour of broadly what MDMD is about. How best do you think we can persuade the politicians who are the obstacle? I mean, it seems to me that a lot of them are terrified of the churches who have grossly exaggerated power in society, and some of them are just don't like to stick their heads above the parapet, so they know that they'll get bombarded with letters from the usual suspects, and that must be even worse nowadays. Do you have any advice for how best to not necessarily get rid of these people, but overcome them?
Yes, of all the people who most merit euthanasia. But your diagnosis is correct. Politicians are a very pusillanimous bunch. And on matters of what they think are great social controversy, so drugs, the legalization of drugs, sex work, and this issue, the issue of the right to die, physician-assisted suicide, they are extremely conservative. The efforts that Dignity in Dying has made over the last 20 years or so, and as I mentioned, we've introduced bill after bill, more and more weekly praised, and every single time it's been just knocked out of the ground mainly of course by those who, under I think sincere influence of their beliefs or traditions that they value, and who have some expertise. So you get people who've been associated with the hospice movement. You might want to say they have a sort of vested interest actually in not letting euthanasia be too general. But you can see that Parliament will only really move once this majority in the population becomes vocal and persistent. Once organizations like this begin to articulate and channel that sentiment in the population, and of course politicians will stampede to pass bills in favour of it. But while they think that it's something that would cost them their jobs or throw a blight on their careers or make them look suspicious to the Daily Mail, well, as is happening, the Daily Mail does seem to be changing its colours a little bit just lately, the new editor. But at any rate, the fear of being pilloried in the tabloid press as a murderer and so on, that's the dead right is what's acting as a drag anchor on them.
Hello, am I audible?
You know.
Thank you. Yvonne Barley. I have put my 3 to 4 years and 10 in the bag, and I have thought these things through and have my plan, my advance directive, my family know, etc., etc., etc. And I'm just going to share an experience I had with you because it was an opportunity outside my normal circle. I had a symptom, was invited to go to a hospital for investigations, cardiac investigations. And in the, on the bed, in the gown, I was given the contra things that might happen. And the final one was cardiac arrest. But don't be worried, because we've got all the stuff here. And I said, oh, well, should that happen, it is my wish not to be resuscitated. I would like my death to come when nature intends, and I don't wish to be resuscitated. And every medical person in the room took 3 steps backwards. And there was a silence, and they looked at each other, and they said then, could you say that again? So I repeated it, and they said, yes, we understand, but there'll be a lot of paperwork to do. And truly the cardiology department came to standstill for half an hour whilst we found it, which I was sorry about. But I explained my rationale, and they were interested. Now, I've moved along from that, and having come to the outcome of those things and been offered medication, I have decided not to take it. I have also given up screening activities, osteoporosis, breast cancer. What is the point if I've made these decisions about having a death in its own time, whilst my quality of life is still good? Okay, there are all sorts of decisions to be made with that. But I think we do have opportunities when we talk to people to talk about our beliefs, as I think we share here. And I'm from the medical profession myself, and I really don't share, my feelings are not shared by my colleagues. And I think we've got an enormous job to do with the medical profession because they're so influential in setting the tone for the politicians and others. So that is my story, but my question is, you didn't actually tell us what the meaning of life was.
Well spotted. It's terribly interesting how one encounters more and more people who say that if they find anything and they're not going to go through all the process and prolong life a little with highly interventive, perhaps unpleasant procedures and so on. A couple of friends recently managed to continue with a reasonable quality of life for a while and probably died sooner than they might have done otherwise. But that was a choice which I think personally is one that I myself would take. So I sympathise with that. Okay, on the meaning of life. Well, when taxi drivers ask me, they say, "All right, governor, what's the meaning of life?" By the way, I'm often amused by the little pause between telling a taxi driver that I teach philosophy or that I'm a professor of philosophy and that question, because you know that he's thinking to himself, thinking, what the heck does a philosopher do when he gets up in the morning? But you know what a plumber does or a doctor or something, but a philosopher? The answer is yes, by the way. Anyway, so I say, I know the answer to that question, what's the meaning of life? And it's this, that the meaning of your life is what you make it. There isn't one thing which is the meaning of life, but which is something that each of us individually has to create, has to make, has to seek out of one's own degree of self-understanding or sense of one's capacities, talents, desires, and interests. And also, one has to be able to make a good case for one's choice. I mean, after all, if you thought to yourself, I think I'd be a pretty good murderer, well, you'd find it quite difficult to make a case to other people that that was a serious and responsible choice. So, you know how it is when your best friend comes and needs advice and you try to be as good a friend to them as you can be and to be sober and well-judging. That's the moment when one should be sober and well-judging about oneself and making a choice about one's aspirations and goals. But whatever they are one's own. It's a feature of this autonomy and responsibility one has. The great Socratic answer to the question, how should one live, what should one be, was one should live the considered, the chosen life. And that simple seeming remark is extremely profound and also very subversive, because the vast majority of people for most of history have been told that there is a one-size-fits-all question of what the meaning of life is. All the great ideologies, the great political systems, and the great religions have all said, we know the truth, this is how to live, this is what to do. But actually, it's each one of us. There are as many meaningful lives as there are people to make them. I know you were reading Albert Camus in the bath last night, weren't you? You remember his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. He asked the question about Sisyphus, that mythological chap who had to roll a boulder up a hill and could never get it to the top and roll down. He was condemned to do this for all eternity. And Camus asks of him, could he have a meaningful existence, even though he is in this absurd and relentless situation? And the answer he gives is yes, because he could choose what the meaning of his life is.
Our first question is actually asked a question about how we actually set about campaigning. So I think I'd like to bring us back to that. It occurs to me, looking around, that the vast majority of people in this room are somewhere around the same age as I am. Maybe a few are older, maybe a few a bit younger. But to me, I wonder how we can actually get much, much younger people involved in this campaign. Because they campaign with a passion and an energy that is actually very different from the sort of passion and energy that we bring up. I think you've only got to look at the the campaign that came up from those young people around gun violence in the United States, just how powerful they could be. And I wonder if the answer does come from a little bit from what you were saying about not only using facts and figures and calm, logical arguments, which we do need, but also employing narrative and other things like that. I think particularly to try and bring in the passion and energy of young people.
Right, well, on the one hand, you might seem to be on an absolute winner with the name MDMD, which sounds like a kind of thing you use at a disco to keep you going, you know, sort of party. You'd have people young people signing up in droves if you. But on the other hand, young people don't think about death, they're going to live forever, they feel immortal. And then the very thought of death and everything associated with it seems awful. Therefore, remember an anecdote told by, who's that? The actor, people of our age, who played Alfie? Michael Caine. Michael Caine tells a story about when he was a very, very young actor. He had a big part in a play in the West End. And what he was meant to do is he was meant to run on stage and deliver a funny line and run off stage again. And it happened that his sleeve got snagged onto a nail in the wings. And all he could do was just put his head round onto the stage like this, deliver his funny line, and pop back in again. And apparently this worked incredibly well with the audience. They thought it was even funnier. And so he said, that taught me a great lesson. Use the difficulty. Use the difficulty. Now, who should be better primed and with a richer understanding of the significance of death and of dying in life and of knowing what kinds of situations people might find themselves in where they would like to make that decision for themselves, but us. Now we're all here, our 21st birthdays have got a bit misty, most of us, not some of us not. So we're in a very, very good position to say, experto crede. Believe the expert. We're people who are closer to the end of life and who have gone through the experience of seeing others whom we love and care about die, either happily or unhappily, and so on. We want to speak out. We, from our generation, want to say this could be one of the great gifts that we give ourselves as a humane, rational, grown-up society, is an easy, good death that we choose, that we are not the prisoners of the bad aspects of life, of old age. You know, they say old age is not for the faint-hearted and so on. We all know why. That we are in a better position to know than other people. You're right that it's really grand to have all the young in their energy and their enthusiasm, but they're much less likely to want to sign up for a campaign like this. That is why the average age here is a bit above 25. So you can see that we're going to speak with the voice of authority and experience, capitalize on it. Let's use that fact about it. We can lead the way. The House of Lords.
It gets through the House of Lords because they're all that much older than their present get through the House of Commons.
Yeah, yes, exactly. There's a very good point made, which is that the debates about these matters tend to be better received in the House of Lords than in the House of Commons. You all know the great story about the House of Lords. A member of the House of Lords dreamt once that he was giving a speech there, woke up and found that he was. Yeah.
You gave us a very vivid picture of a human being in a cage in a dark place being fed bread and water. Now, if a human being actually is in a cage in those circumstances for a little while, the newspapers will shout outrage. Girl in Camden found 5 years in cage, dark room, bread and water. Outrage. And I was moved by a question on emotion. And I wonder if we've got our campaigning perhaps the wrong way around. Instead of being rational about it's my death, it's my decision, maybe we should be shouting, outrageous, poor old woman, poor old man, kept in agony for 9 months by doctors. Should we perhaps take that angle as well?
Oh, absolutely. No, I think you're dead right. I think that's a very good point. I mean, the case of Omid is a perfect example of this desperate to be helped to die. And the most intolerable situation that dragged on and on and on. So there are people here in this room who know that case very well, and it is a case in point, as they say. Dead right. By the way, it's not doctors. One mustn't blame doctors. One must be good kind doctors. You might need them one day. The thing is that it's been, the point has been made before. Doctors are there to cure or care, or to palliate, or to help. And many doctors who deal with terminally ill patients do help them to slip away comfortably. We know that, but always at risk themselves of prosecution if ever anybody sort of turned on them. I'll tell you who the real culprits mainly are, is the families of people. We don't want their mother or father or grandmother or something to be let go.
That's why you have to do advanced decisions, so your children can't stop.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. We've got to fight back on those who don't want to let us go and keep us suffering. I remember when my father was in his last illness, he was living abroad and he was nearly 80. I got a telephone call saying your father's in hospital with pneumonia. He didn't think so last weekend. I jumped on a plane. My brother was on the other side of the world. He jumped on a plane. We managed to get there. And my father was a man of the most beautiful courtesy and with wonderful old-fashioned manners. And the thought of dying while he had guests was completely out of the question. So we sat there day after day, and he was far too polite to say, look, I wish to stop you, to push off and really get on with it. And then I said to him, after about 10 days or so, I was teaching in Oxford, and I had a whole lot of pupils who were getting ready for schools, and I said to him, look, I've got to get my people through their exams, and I'll come out again as soon as all that's done. He said, absolutely. When we bid farewell, I arrived at Heathrow and found a message, and he died.
So, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop questions there. So I promised Professor Grayling.
I have to go to Birmingham, my friend.
He has to go to Birmingham. So, thank you very much. Obviously, a lot to think about there. Some very good questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more questions, but that's the way it is. I think a lot of things came up. That thing about emotion versus rationale, I think is a very important point for us to try and get the balance about. I think the thing that Professor Grayling was saying about using the fact that we are experts. If we have helped or understood what's happened perhaps to our parents or our friends at the end of life, seeing what doesn't work, that gives us a level of authority. I can speak personally, that's why I got involved. If you have looked at the website, looked at the personal stories, you'll see what happened to my mother. And I think the point at the back that about making our own wishes known, formally in terms of an advanced decision, but also informally, with conversations with our next of kin, our children, our friends, whoever are the appropriate people. I think there's a lot that we can do as individuals.